The excavator's mechanical growl reverberated through Mark Donovan's backyard on a sweltering June morning, drowning out the cheerful birdsong that usually accompanied his morning coffee. The machine's metal claw tore into the concrete surrounding his once-beloved swimming pool, the very feature that had sold him on the house 12 years ago. Mark winced as another chunk of concrete crashed into the growing pile of debris, sending a plume of dust into the air. "You sure about this, Mr. Donovan?" The contractor shouted over the din, wiping sweat from his brow. "Once we break through the liner, there's no going back." Mark nodded firmly, though a twinge of nostalgia pulled at him. The pool had been the site of countless summer barbecues, his daughter's swimming lessons, and lazy Sunday afternoons. But those days were gone now. Emily was off at college, and after his divorce 3 years ago, the pool had become nothing more than an expensive, time-consuming reminder of happier times. "I'm sure," Mark called back. "The estimates for repairs were more than I want to spend, and I haven't used it properly in 2 years." As if to punctuate his decision, the excavator's claw pierced the fiberglass liner with a satisfying crack. Mark raised his coffee mug in a silent toast to the end of an era. By next week, this space would be transformed into a low-maintenance patio and garden area, something practical that wouldn't drain his wallet or his weekends. What Mark didn't notice was the curtain twitching in the second-floor window of the house immediately behind his. Nor did he see the woman with the immaculately highlighted bob taking photographs with her phone, her lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. Nancy Whitfield had moved into Oak Ridge Estates 6 months ago and had quickly appointed herself the unofficial guardian of neighborhood property values. Her home inspection had specifically noted the premium views of neighboring pool as an asset, and she had factored this into her offering price. Now that asset was being systematically destroyed before her eyes. Mark was just signing off on the first day's work when his doorbell rang with an insistence that suggested someone had been pressing it for some time. Opening his front door, he found himself face to face with a woman he recognized vaguely from neighborhood association meetings but had never actually spoken to. "Can I help you?" he asked, immediately put off by the tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Nancy Whitfield from Maple Lane," she said, extending a hand that Mark reluctantly shook. "I couldn't help but notice the construction in your backyard." Mark nodded slowly. "I'm removing my pool. It's become a maintenance issue." Nancy's smile remained fixed, but her eyes hardened. "I see. And did you get approval from the HOA for this major structural change?" "Because I checked the bylaws, and any modification that affects neighboring property views requires a committee review." Mark felt a flicker of irritation. His decision to remove the pool had been difficult enough without neighborhood interference. "Actually, I did. The HOA approved it last month. I have the paperwork if you'd like to see it." This clearly wasn't the response Nancy had expected. She faltered momentarily before recovering. "Well, I think you'll find the approval is conditional on neighborly consideration. Did you consider how this would affect those of us whose property values benefit from your pool?" Mark stared at her, unable to process the audacity of her complaint. "I'm sorry, but my backyard isn't a public amenity. I'm well within my rights to—" "We'll see about that," Nancy cut him off, her polite veneer cracking. "This neighborhood has standards, Mr. Donovan. Standards that some of us care deeply about maintaining." As she turned on her heel and marched down his front path, Mark had the distinct feeling that his pool removal had just become significantly more complicated than he'd anticipated. What he couldn't know was just how far Nancy Whitfield was willing to go to protect what she perceived as her rights, or that by this time tomorrow, his private home improvement project would become the most public affair in Oak Ridge Estate's 20-year history. By 7 o'clock the following morning, the construction crew had returned to Mark's property, ready to continue dismantling the pool. The foreman, a burly man named Lou, who had spent 30 years turning people's backyard dreams into reality, handed out assignments to his team with the efficient precision of someone who knew exactly how these jobs should progress. "We'll drain what's left of the water first, then finish breaking up the shell," Lou explained to Mark, who had taken the day off work to oversee the project. "Should be ready for backfill by tomorrow afternoon." Mark nodded, surveying the half-demolished pool with a mixture of relief and melancholy. The rectangular hole that had once been the centerpiece of family gatherings now looked forlorn and abandoned, its exposed pipes and cracked concrete like the skeleton of a beach whale. He was about to head inside to make another pot of coffee when a police cruiser pulled up in front of his house, its lights flashing but siren mercifully silent. Mark's stomach dropped. The neighbors already had their curtains twitching. This was exactly the kind of spectacle he'd hoped to avoid. 2 officers approached, one young and stone-faced, the other older with the weary expression of someone who had responded to one too many neighborhood disputes. Their badges identified them as Officer Reynolds and Sergeant Martinez. "Good morning, sir," Martinez said, her tone professionally neutral. "Are you Mark Donovan, the homeowner?" "I am," Mark confirmed, eyeing the officers warily. "Is there a problem?" We received a complaint about unauthorized construction and possible environmental violations, Reynolds said, glancing past Mark at the pool demolition. Someone reported that you're improperly disposing of pool chemicals and creating a hazardous situation. Mark felt heat rising in his face. That's absolutely false. We drained the pool weeks ago following all county regulations. The water was properly treated and tested before disposal, and I have documentation to prove it. He gestured toward Lou, who was already approaching with a clipboard. My contractor has all the permits and environmental clearances right here. While Lou discussed the paperwork with Reynolds, Martinez took Mark aside. Between you and me, Mr. Donovan, this looks like a neighbor dispute. The caller was quite insistent that we respond immediately, claiming there were children at risk of chemical exposure. Mark didn't need to ask who had made the call. Let me guess, Nancy Whitfield from Maple Lane? Martinez's carefully neutral expression confirmed his suspicion. I can't comment on who made the report, but I would suggest that if you're having issues with neighbors, it might be worth trying to resolve them directly before they escalate further. I would have been happy to discuss this reasonably, Mark said, struggling to keep his voice level. But she seems more interested in control than conversation. The officers conducted a perfunctory inspection of the work site, finding nothing amiss. As they prepared to leave, Martinez handed Mark her card. Everything looks in order, Mr. Donovan. Your permits are valid and the contractor is following proper protocols. But call if you need anything. Neighborhood disputes have a way of getting out of hand quickly. Mark had just breathed a sigh of relief when his phone vibrated with a text notification. It was from Cynthia Weber, the president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, requesting an urgent meeting regarding his pool removal project. The message was followed by a link to an emergency HOA board meeting scheduled for that evening. Curious, Mark tapped on the neighborhood Facebook group he rarely checked and felt his blood pressure spike. Nancy had been busy. A post with over 40 comments showed photos of his backyard demolition alongside alarming claims about unauthorized construction, environmental hazards, and plummeting property values. She had even included a shot through his living room window of him drinking beer the previous evening, captioned, "Homeowner celebrates destroying our neighborhood's appeal." The comments were a mixed bag. Some neighbors expressed genuine concern about property values, while others defended Mark's right to modify his own property. But the damage was done. What should have been a private home improvement decision had become a public referendum on Mark's character and consideration for the community. Just as Mark was considering how to respond, his doorbell rang again. This time, it wasn't the police or an angry neighbor, but a fresh-faced young woman with a press badge and a cameraman trailing behind her. "Mr. Donovan, I'm Alicia Jenkins from Channel 8 News. We received a tip about a neighborhood dispute involving pool removal and environmental concerns. Would you care to comment on the situation?" Mark stared at the reporter in disbelief, the realization dawning that Nancy Whitfield had just elevated their dispute from a neighborhood squabble to local news fodder. Behind him, Lou and his crew exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the unexpected publicity. The construction site that Mark had hoped would represent a fresh start was now a battlefield in a suburban war he never wanted to fight. And as the camera focused on his stunned expression, he knew that the worst was likely yet to come. By 7 o'clock the following morning, the construction crew had returned to Mark's property, ready to continue dismantling the pool. The foreman, a burly man named Lou who had spent 30 years turning people's backyard dreams into reality, handed out assignments to his team with the efficient precision of someone who knew exactly how these jobs should progress. "We'll drain what's left of the water first, then finish breaking up the shell," Lou explained to Mark, who had taken the day off work to oversee the project. "Should be ready for backfill by tomorrow afternoon." Mark nodded, surveying the half-demolished pool with a mixture of relief and melancholy. The rectangular hole that had once been the centerpiece of family gatherings now looked forlorn and abandoned, its exposed pipes and cracked concrete like the skeleton of a beach whale. He was about to head inside to make another pot of coffee when a police cruiser pulled up in front of his house, its lights flashing but siren mercifully silent. Mark's stomach dropped. The neighbors already had their curtains twitching. This was exactly the kind of spectacle he hoped to avoid. Two officers approached, one young and stone-faced, the other older with the weary expression of someone who had responded to one too many neighborhood disputes. Their badges identified them as Officer Reynolds and Sergeant Martinez. "Good morning, sir," Martinez said, her tone professionally neutral. "Are you Mark Donovan, the homeowner?" "I am," Mark confirmed, eyeing the officers warily. "Is there a problem?" "We received a complaint about unauthorized construction and possible environmental violations," Reynolds said, glancing past Mark at the pool demolition. "Someone reported that you're improperly disposing of pool chemicals and creating a hazardous situation." Mark felt heat rising in his face. "That's absolutely false. We drained the pool weeks ago following all county regulations. The water was properly treated and tested before disposal, and I have documentation to prove it. He gestured toward Lou, who was already approaching with a clipboard. My contractor has all the permits and environmental clearances right here. While Lou discussed the paperwork with Reynolds, Martinez took Mark aside. Between you and me, Mr. Donovan, this looks like a neighbor dispute. The caller was quite insistent that we respond immediately, claiming there were children at risk of chemical exposure. Mark didn't even ask who had made the call. Let me guess, Nancy Whitfield from Maple Lane? Martinez's carefully neutral expression confirmed his suspicion. I can't comment on who made the report, but I would suggest that if you're having issues with neighbors, it might be worth trying to resolve them directly before they escalate further. I would have been happy to discuss this reasonably, Mark said, struggling to keep his voice level, but she seems more interested in control than conversation. The officers conducted a perfunctory inspection of the worksite, finding nothing amiss. As they prepared to leave, Martinez handed Mark her card. Everything looks in order, Mr. Donovan. Your permits are valid and the contractor is following proper protocols. But call if you need anything. Neighborhood disputes have a way of getting out of hand quickly. Mark had just breathed a sigh of relief when his phone vibrated with a text notification. It was from Cynthia Weber, the president of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, requesting an urgent meeting regarding his pool removal project. The message was followed by a link to an emergency HOA board meeting scheduled for that evening. Curious, Mark tapped on the neighborhood Facebook group he rarely checked and felt his blood pressure spike. Nancy had been busy. A post with over 40 comments showed photos of his backyard demolition alongside alarming claims about unauthorized construction, environmental hazards, and plummeting property values. She had even included a shot through his living room window of him drinking beer the previous evening, captioned, "Homeowner celebrates destroying our neighborhood's appeal." The comments were a mixed bag. Some neighbors expressed genuine concern about property values, while others defended Mark's right to modify his own property. But the damage was done. What should have been a private home improvement decision had become a public referendum on Mark's character and consideration for the community. Just as Mark was considering how to respond, his doorbell rang again. This time, it wasn't the police or an angry neighbor, but a fresh-faced young woman with a press badge and a cameraman trailing behind her. "Mr. Donovan, I'm Alicia Jenkins from Channel 8 News. We received a tip about a neighborhood dispute involving pool removal and environmental concerns. Would you care to comment on the situation?" Mark stared at the reporter in disbelief, the realization dawning that Nancy Whitfield had just elevated their dispute from a neighborhood squabble to local news fodder. Behind him, Lou and his crew exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the unexpected publicity. The construction site that Mark had hoped would represent a fresh start was now a battlefield in a suburban war he never wanted to fight. And as the camera focused on his stunned expression, he knew that the worst was likely yet to come. The emergency HOA meeting that evening was held in the Oak Ridge Estates Community Center, a modest building usually reserved for yoga classes and children's birthday parties. Tonight, however, it transformed into something resembling a courtroom, with Mark Donovan reluctantly cast in the role of defendant. The small room was packed beyond capacity. Residents who had never shown interest in HOA proceedings were suddenly eager participants, drawn by the drama that had unfolded on their community Facebook page throughout the day. Some even stood along the back wall, clutching printed copies of bylaws and property regulations like weapons. Cynthia Weber, the HOA president, a retired school principal with a no-nonsense demeanor and a talent for mediation, called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel. "Before we begin," she announced, eyeing the unusually large crowd, "I want to remind everyone that this is a community discussion, not a trial. We will maintain civil discourse at all times." Her gaze lingered pointedly on Nancy Whitfield, who sat in the front row with a thick binder of papers and an expression of righteous determination. "Now, the board has called this emergency meeting to address concerns regarding the pool removal project at 47 Oak Ridge Drive. Mr. Donovan, would you like to speak first?" Mark stood, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes fixed on him. He had spent the afternoon reviewing his HOA approval documents and property rights with a growing sense of indignation. "Thank you," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. "As most of you know, I'm removing my backyard pool. I submitted all required documentation to the HOA 3 months ago and received written approval." He held up the letter bearing Cynthia's signature. "The project complies with all local ordinances, and my contractor has obtained every necessary permit." He paused, scanning the faces of his neighbors. Some nodded encouragingly, while others remained impassive. "I understand that change can be concerning, but this is ultimately a decision about my property and my finances. The pool has become a burden I can no longer justify maintaining, especially since my daughter left for college. I plan to replace it with an eco-friendly garden space that will actually enhance our neighborhood's appearance." As Mark sat down, Nancy immediately shot to her feet without waiting to be acknowledged. While Mr. Donovan might have technically followed procedures, she began, her voice sharp with accusation, he has failed to consider the community impact of his selfish decision. She dramatically opened her binder and extracted a glossy real estate listing. When I purchased my home 6 months ago, the property was valued partly based on the premium views it offered, specifically the view of Mr. Donovan's pool from my back windows. I have documentation from my realtor confirming this added approximately $15,000 to my property value. A murmur rippled through the crowd as Nancy continued gaining momentum. Furthermore, studies show that neighborhoods with visible aquatic features command higher overall property values. By removing his pool, Mr. Donovan is essentially stealing money from every homeowner in Oak Ridge Estates. That's ridiculous, called out a voice from the back of the room. It belonged to Dave Chen, who had lived in the neighborhood even longer than Mark. We don't all have some kind of shared ownership of each other's backyards. What's next? I need approval to change my curtains because you can see them from your house. Several people laughed, but Nancy remained undeterred. This isn't about curtains, it's about property values. And there's more. She turned to Cynthia. I've consulted with an environmental attorney who believes there are serious questions about the impact of this project on the local watershed. We're prepared to file for an emergency injunction if necessary. The meeting quickly devolved into chaos, with neighbors taking sides and speaking over one another. Some defended property owners' rights to modify their own backyards, while others worried about setting precedents that could affect the character of the neighborhood. Throughout the heated discussion, Mark noticed something interesting. Nancy's most vocal supporters were all relatively new to the neighborhood, while those who had lived there longer seemed more supportive of his position. Eventually, Cynthia restored order by threatening to adjourn the meeting entirely. This is getting us nowhere, she said firmly. The board has reviewed Mr. Donovan's documentation again today, and I can confirm that his project was properly approved through our established processes. Unless someone can identify a specific bylaw violation, not just a personal preference, the HOA has no grounds to revoke the approval. Nancy's face flushed crimson. Then perhaps it's time to review the competency of this board, she snapped. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current leadership. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Even Nancy's supporters looked uncomfortable with this escalation. Cynthia regarded Nancy with a calm assessment of someone who had managed classrooms full of unruly teenagers for decades. Motion noted, but out of order for this emergency meeting. If you wish to propose board changes, you'll need to follow the procedures outlined in our bylaws, which require written notice and a scheduled vote. As the meeting concluded without the resolution Nancy had clearly hoped for, Mark felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Miguel Reyes, who lived 3 doors down. This isn't really about your pool, Miguel said quietly. Nancy tried to get the board to stop my rooftop solar panel installation last month, and before that, she fought Dave's garden shed addition. She's trying to establish herself as the neighborhood power broker. Mark nodded slowly, pieces falling into place. So I'm just the latest target? Exactly. But listen, a bunch of us are getting together tomorrow night at Dave's to figure out how to handle this situation. Not just your pool, but the bigger Nancy problem. You should join us. As Mark left the community center, he couldn't help noticing Nancy huddled with 2 other neighbors, gesturing animatedly in his direction. The babble over his pool had clearly evolved into something much larger, a defining moment for the neighborhood's culture and future. What had begun as a simple home improvement project had become the catalyst for a community reckoning. And although Mark had never sought this role, he realized he now had a responsibility not just to defend his own property rights, but to help preserve the reasonable, neighborly atmosphere that had made Oak Ridge Estates a place worth living in the first place. Walking to his car, he found himself planning not just for the completion of his pool removal, but for the community coalition meeting tomorrow night. For the first time since Nancy had appeared on his doorstep, Mark felt a sense of resolve replace his indignation. This wasn't just about a pool anymore. It was about what kind of neighborhood they all wanted to live in. Mark awoke to the sound of machinery outside his window. For a moment, he thought it was the excavator returning to continue work on his pool, but the pitch was different, higher, more insistent. Pulling aside his bedroom curtain, he squinted against the early morning sunlight to see an official-looking van parked at the curb. 2 people in county uniforms were setting up equipment on his front lawn. He threw on a robe and hurried outside, coffee forgotten. "Excuse me," he called as he approached. "What's going on here?" A woman with a clipboard looked up. "Water Resources Department. We're conducting soil and groundwater testing." She handed him a document. "This is our inspection warrant." Mark scanned the paper in disbelief. "Inspection warrant? On what grounds?" "We received multiple reports of potential groundwater contamination related to improper pool drainage," she replied, her tone suggesting this was routine. "Standard procedure requires us to investigate." Behind her, Her colleague was already driving a sampling probe into Mark's front lawn. Mark felt a surge of anger. This is Nancy Whitfield's doing, isn't it? The inspector maintained her professional demeanor. I'm not at liberty to discuss who filed the report, sir. We're just doing our job. Mark retreated inside to make urgent calls, first to Lou, then to his homeowner's insurance, and finally to Miguel, who had promised to connect him with someone who might help. As he waited for callbacks, he watched from his window as neighbors drove past, slowing to observe the county officials working on his property. Some took photos with their phones. By mid-morning, the sampling team had moved to his backyard, where Lou and his crews stood idly by, unable to continue their work until the inspection was complete. The delay would cost Mark extra money he hadn't budgeted for. His phone rang. It was Jan Espinoza, an attorney Miguel had recommended who specialized in property disputes and HOA law. Miguel gave me a brief overview, Janet said after introducing herself. Tell me everything from the beginning. Mark recounted the events of the past 3 days, from Nancy's initial confrontation through the police visit, the HOA meeting, and now the county inspection. When he finished, Janet sighed. Unfortunately, this isn't unusual. In the last few years, I've seen a significant increase in these types of neighborhood campaigns. Usually, it's a small group of residents who use regulatory systems, police, code enforcement, HOAs as weapons in personal disputes. So what can I do? Mark asked, watching as the county officials collected another soil sample. First, document everything. Every interaction, every report, every delay. Second, continue following all regulations to the letter, which it sounds like you're already doing. Third, build community support. From what Miguel told me, you've already got several neighbors on your side. And fourth, Mark asked, consider going on the offensive, Janet said. There are laws against filing false reports and malicious use of regulatory processes. I'm not saying we're there yet, but if these inspections come back clean and she continues, we have options. After ending the call, Mark felt more determined than ever. The temporary halt to his project was frustrating, but at least he had a plan. That evening, Mark joined 7 other homeowners at Dave Chen's house. The gathering felt clandestine, though they were doing nothing wrong, just neighbors meeting to discuss a shared problem. First, some good news, Dave announced once everyone had settled in his living room. I spoke with Cynthia Weber today. The HOA board is considering amendments to clarify that aesthetic preferences don't constitute valid grounds for construction objections. That won't stop Nancy, said Elaine Fujita, an elderly woman who had lived in Oak Ridge Estates since it was built. Last year, she reported my Japanese maple tree as a hazard because some leaves fell on her driveway. The city arborist had to come inspect it, a perfectly healthy 40-year-old tree. Others shared similar stories. Spurious code violation reports, complaints about children's toys visible from the street, disputes over fence heights that were within regulation. A pattern emerged of Nancy targeting especially those households that disagreed with her at HOA meetings. She's a bully, Miguel said simply. And like most bullies, she backs down when confronted by a united front. They'd formulated a strategy. First, they would circulate a neighborhood petition affirming support for reasonable property rights and opposing frivolous use of regulatory resources. Second, they would attend the next regular HOA meeting as a block to support the board's proposed amendments. Third, they would each write to the county commissioners about the waste of taxpayer resources on vindictive inspections. As the meeting concluded, Mark felt a renewed sense of community. These were people who had lived alongside each other for years, respecting boundaries and differences. Nancy's aggressive tactics had actually strengthened their bonds. Walking home under the starlit sky, Mark spotted a familiar figure standing near his partially demolished pool, Nancy taking more photographs. She had him noticing approaching from the side yard. Finding what you're looking for? He asked quietly. Nancy startled, nearly dropping her phone. I'm documenting the environmental damage, she said, recovering quickly. The county officials were very concerned by what they found today. Mark smiled, knowing this was a bluff. Actually, they weren't. The lead inspector told me the preliminary tests showed nothing unusual, and they'll have official results in a few days. But you probably already knew that since you must have called them repeatedly asking for updates. For just a moment, Nancy's composure slipped, revealing something Mark hadn't expected to see: fear. Not of him, but of failure, of losing control. This isn't over, she said, her voice lacking its usual confidence. Property values will fall. The neighborhood character will change. Everything has to be maintained to a standard. The neighborhood isn't a museum exhibit, Nancy. It's a living community. Things change. Not if I can help it, she replied, but her words sounded hollow as she hurried back toward her own property. Mark watched her go, understanding for the first time that Nancy's crusade wasn't really about his pool or property values. It was about her desperate need for control, for things to remain fixed and predictable in a world that was anything but. The The realization didn't make her actions less frustrating, but it did help him see the situation more clearly. This wasn't just a battle over a pool, it was a clash between different visions of community, and as he surveyed the constellation of lights from his neighbors' homes, Mark knew which vision he was fighting for. The next morning arrived with an unexpected development. As Mark sat on his front porch with his first cup of coffee, a sleek black Tesla pulled into his driveway. A man in impeccable suit emerged, tall, silver-haired, with a confident bearing of someone accustomed to being in charge. Mark didn't recognize him, but something about his demeanor immediately put him on alert. "Mark Donovan," the man called, approaching with an outstretched hand. "Richard Whitfield. I believe you've met my wife, Nancy." Mark set down his coffee and stood, shaking the offered hand with cautious politeness. "Yes, we've met." Richard's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I've been away on business, just got back last night. Nancy filled me in on this situation." He glanced toward the backyard where Lou's crew was setting up for another day of work, the county inspectors having finally cleared them to continue. "I see," Mark said neutrally, waiting to see where this was going. "Look, I'll be direct," Richard said, lowering his voice. "Nancy can be passionate about neighborhood issues. When we moved here, I promised her the perfect suburban life, and she takes that vision seriously." Mark raised an eyebrow. "So seriously that she's filed false reports and harassed multiple neighbors?" Richard winced slightly. "I understand there's been some friction. That's why I'm here, to propose a solution." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded check. "We're prepared to cover the costs of reinstalling your pool, plus an additional $20,000 for your trouble." Mark stared at the check, momentarily speechless. "You want to pay me to rebuild my pool?" "Consider it an investment in neighborhood harmony," Richard said smoothly. "Nancy gets her view back, you get brand new pool at no cost to you, everyone wins." Mark handed the check back. "I appreciate the offer, but no, this isn't about money. It's about being able to make reasonable decisions about my own property without interference." "Be practical, Mark," Richard pressed. "This could drag on for months. Legal fees, continued inspections, construction delays, all costing you time and money. Why not take the path of least resistance?" Before Mark could respond, a car door slammed nearby. They both turned to see Cynthia Weber approaching, a folder tucked under her arm and determination in her stride. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said briskly. "Mr. Whitfield, I'm surprised to see you here. I've been trying to reach you about several HOA matters." Richard's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "I've been traveling, as you know. Business demands." "Of course," Cynthia nodded. "Well, since you're here, I can save myself a trip to your house." She handed him a document from her folder. "This is a formal warning regarding the unauthorized structural changes to your back deck. The extended pergola violates our setback requirements by nearly 3 feet." Richard's composure slipped for just a moment. "That's impossible." "The contractor assured us." "The contractor should have obtained proper permits," Cynthia interrupted. "The same permits and approvals that Mr. Donovan correctly secured for his pool removal." She turned to Mark, "Which brings me to my visit. The board has reviewed the county inspection report that came in this morning. No environmental concerns were found, so you're officially cleared to continue your project without further HOA oversight." As if on cue, Miguel pulled up in his SUV, followed by 3 more vehicles, all neighbors from last night's meeting. They converged on Mark's front yard, each carrying clipboards. "What's this?" Richard asked, his confident demeanor beginning to crack. Miguel stepped forward. "Community Action Committee. We're collecting signatures for our petition supporting homeowners' rights and opposing frivolous regulatory complaints." He smiled at Richard. "Would you care to sign, Mr. Whitfield? It would be a strong gesture of neighborhood unity." Richard glanced from Miguel to Cynthia to Mark, clearly calculating his options. "I think Nancy and I need to discuss this matter further," he said finally. "Mark, my offer remains open, should you reconsider." As Richard retreated to his Tesla, Cynthia watched him go with a satisfied expression. "Interesting how quickly bullies back down when confronted," she remarked. "The pergola violation is real, by the way. We overlooked it until now, but given recent events—" "Fighting fire with fire?" Mark asked. Cynthia smiled. "Let's call it leveraging available administrative remedies. Sometimes people need a reminder that rules apply to everyone." By midday, Miguel and the others had collected signatures from over half the neighborhood. Support for the petition was stronger than anyone had anticipated, with even previously uninvolved residents eager to sign once they understood the situation. Mark spent the afternoon supervising the pool demolition, which was proceeding rapidly now that the delays had been resolved. Lou estimated they'd be ready for backfill by tomorrow, with landscaping to follow next week. Around 4 o'clock, Mark was surprised to see a Channel 8 news van pull up again. The same reporter, Alicia Jenkins, approached, but this time her cameraman stayed in the vehicle. "Mr. Donovan," she began, "I want to follow up on our story." Mark sighed. Look, I appreciate that neighborhood disputes make for easy content, but this is really a private matter. Alicia surprised him with a sympathetic smile. Actually, that's why I'm here. After our initial report, we received calls from several Oak Ridge Estates residents who felt the story was one-sided. They mentioned a pattern of similar conflicts involving your neighbor, Mrs. Whitfield. Did they? Mark said carefully. We did some digging, Alicia continued. It turns out Mrs. Whitfield has filed similar complaints in 3 previous neighborhoods where she's lived. There's actually a Facebook group called Nancy Whitfield Survivors, with members from different communities across the state. Mark couldn't help but laugh. You're kidding. Journalism is funny that way. You start pulling one thread and sometimes a whole tapestry unravels, Alicia said. We're working on a larger piece now about how some homeowners weaponize HOAs and municipal regulations against their neighbors. Would you be willing to be interviewed for that story instead? Mark considered the request. I would, but only if the focus is on the broader issue, not just my situation or Nancy specifically. This is happening in communities everywhere, and people should understand both their rights and their responsibilities as neighbors. As Alicia left with a promise to return for a proper interview later in the week, Mark noticed Nancy watching from her upstairs window. Unlike her previous surveillance, she made no attempt to hide this time, meeting his gaze directly when he looked up. There was something different in her expression, not defeat exactly, but perhaps the first hint of recognition that her campaign was faltering. The neighborhood wasn't rallying to her cause as she'd expected. Instead, her actions had galvanized a community that had grown too complacent to stand up for its values until pushed too far. Later that evening, as Mark sat on his patio watching the sunset glow on the half-demolished pool, his phone pinged with a text from Richard Whitfield. We should talk. Not about money this time, about finding a real solution. Mark stared at the message for a long moment before replying, I'm listening. The battle over his pool had exposed fault lines in the neighborhood that had been quietly developing for years. But maybe, just maybe, addressing those tensions openly would lead to a stronger community in the end. Not one where everyone always agreed, but one where disagreements were handled with respect rather than retribution. As fireflies began to flicker in the gathering dusk, Mark found himself oddly grateful for the conflict that had disrupted his simple renovation plans. Sometimes it took a storm to clear the air. The community center was packed once again, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different from the emergency HOA meeting just a week earlier. Tonight was the regular monthly meeting, and attendance had tripled. Residents who had lived in Oak Ridge Estates for years without ever attending an HOA meeting now filled every seat, with more standing along the walls. Mark sat with Miguel, Dave, and several other neighbors who had become unlikely allies in what the community had started calling the Pool Rebellion. Across the room, Nancy Whitfield sat rigidly beside her husband Richard, who kept checking his watch as though he had more important places to be. Before we begin our regular agenda, Cynthia Weber announced once the meeting was called to order, I'd like to address the matter that's brought so many of you here tonight. Over the past week, our neighborhood has experienced unprecedented tensions regarding property rights and community standards. She gestured toward a stack of documents on the table before her. The board has received the petitions circulated by our Community Action Committee, signed by 137 households, more than 2/3 of our community. We've also received 17 letters regarding frivolous regulatory complaints and their impact on neighborhood relations. Nancy shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Richard placed a hand on her arm. Whether in restraint or comfort wasn't clear. In light of this feedback, Cynthia continued, the board is proposing amendments to our bylaws that would clarify several key points. She proceeded to outline changes that would strengthen homeowners' rights to make reasonable modifications to their properties, establish a more rigorous process for filing complaints, and implement penalties for submitting demonstrably false reports. When she opened the floor for discussion, Nancy immediately raised her hand. All eyes turned to her as she rose to speak. I understand that recent events have created divisions in our community, she began, her voice less strident than Mark had ever heard it. But I want to remind everyone that property values affect us all. When I've raised concerns, it's been with the entire neighborhood's interests at heart. A murmur of skepticism rippled through the crowd. Nancy pressed on. That said, perhaps there have been times when my enthusiasm for maintaining standards has come across as interference. That was never my intention. Richard cleared his throat meaningfully, and Nancy glanced at him before continuing. My husband and I have had several discussions about finding a better balance. We love this neighborhood and want to be good neighbors. In that spirit, we'll be withdrawing all pending complaints and supporting the proposed amendments. The room fell silent in collective shock. This was the last thing anyone had expected from Nancy Whitfield. After a moment, Cynthia recovered her composure. Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield. That's a welcome development. The meeting continued with discussions of the specific amendments, but Mark found his attention drawn to Nancy and Richard. Something significant had clearly happened between them since their visit to his house. Richard's expression was grim but resolved, while Nancy appeared subdued but not defeated. When the meeting adjourned, Mark was surprised to see Richard approaching him, this time without Nancy. "Got a minute?" Richard asked. They stepped outside into the cool evening air, away from the clusters of neighbors still chatting inside. "I owe you an apology," Richard said without preamble, "and an explanation, though it doesn't excuse what's happened." Mark nodded, waiting. "When we moved here, Nancy was already anxious about fitting in. She's always struggled with change, with feeling secure. In our previous neighborhoods, she found that taking on the role of standards enforcer gave her a sense of purpose and control." Richard stared into the distance. "I enabled it, I'm afraid. It was easier to let her focus on neighborhood issues than to address the real problems. But after your situation made the news, I got calls from business associates who recognized our address. It was embarrassing. It forced me to see how out of hand things had gotten." "So what changed?" Mark asked. "We had a long talk, several, actually. Brutally honest ones," Richard sighed. "Nancy agreed to start seeing a therapist to work on her anxiety and control issues. And I promised to be more present, to help her find healthier ways to engage with the community." Richard turned to face Mark directly. "I'm not asking for immediate forgiveness or understanding. Just a chance for us to reset and move forward as neighbors. The amendments are good, by the way. They create accountability while still protecting everyone's interests." Mark considered the man before him, not the slick businessman who had offered him a check, but someone clearly struggling with his own role in a difficult situation. "Everyone deserves a second chance," Mark said finally. "The real test will be what happens from here." Richard nodded. "Fair enough." As they parted ways, Mark spotted Alicia Jenkins from Channel 8 News interviewing Cynthia near the community center entrance. She waved him over. "Mr. Donovan." "Perfect timing. We're doing a follow-up on how communities can resolve these types of conflicts constructively. The story's taking a much more positive direction than we initially expected." The following morning, work on Mark's former pool site was nearing completion. The hole had been properly filled and compacted, creating a clean slate for the landscaping to come. Lou and his crew were laying out the framework for a patio area when a silver BMW pulled into Mark's driveway. Nancy Whitfield stepped out carrying a potted plant. She approached cautiously, her usual confidence nowhere in evidence. "Good morning," she said, her voice barely audible over the construction noise. Mark nodded. "Nancy, I brought this as a, well, not an apology exactly, because a plant doesn't erase what happened, but as a peace offering." She held out the pot, which contained a young Japanese maple tree. "It's a dwarf variety, won't grow more than 15 feet tall, so it won't block any views." Mark accepted the plant, surprised by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "Thank you. They look nice in the new landscape design." Nancy glanced toward the backyard. "What are you planning for the space?" "A natural garden area with native plants, a small patio, and a fire pit," Mark explained. "Drought-resistant and low maintenance, but still attractive." Nancy nodded. "That sounds actually quite nice." She hesitated, then added, "If you'd like any input on the plantings, gardening is something I genuinely know about. Not as an HOA enforcer, just as someone who loves gardens." The offer seemed sincere. "I might take you up on that," Mark said, surprising himself. "The landscaper is coming tomorrow to finalize plans." As Nancy returned to her car, Mark realized the enormous shift that had occurred in just a week. The pool that had been the center of such conflict was gone, but in its place was the possibility of something unexpected. Not friendship exactly, but perhaps a more authentic community where differences could exist without becoming divisions. That evening, Mark sat on his back porch, looking out at the bare earth that would soon become his new outdoor space. His phone buzzed with a text from his daughter, Emily, responding to the photos he'd sent of the transformation. "Looks great, Dad. Can't wait to see the finished project when I come home for summer break. Proud of you for standing your ground and finding a way forward with the neighbors. That's the dad I know." Mark smiled, feeling a sense of closure. The pool was gone, but not the memories it had contained. Those remained, just as the community remained, changed, challenged, but ultimately strengthened by confronting its problems honestly. In the distance, he could hear children playing, neighbors chatting over fences, the everyday sounds of suburban life continuing. His backyard would evolve, as would Oak Ridge Estates itself. Change was inevitable. The only choice was how to face it. Together, it seemed, was better than alone.